Welcome to another tax resolution training video from taxmarketinghq.com.
All right, let's march on through the rest of IRM section 5.1.1. A lot of these things I'm only going to be pointing out some highlights, some things you need to know. Like I said at the beginning, within this particular section of the IRM, there's just a lot of computer type stuff or kind of common sense stuff that's documented for revenue officers, but that as practitioners, we just really don't need to know. So this is kind of the highlight reel, if you will, of this section of the IRM. So IRM section 5.1.1.3.2, mailing and faxing guidelines. Yes, the IRS has written guidelines about how revenue officers are supposed to mail and fax. Most of these are based on Privacy Act and security protocols to protect taxpayer information. Basically, the gist here is that whenever an RO is going to mail or fax something, they have to be cognizant of who they're sending it to, and the IRM requires that they consider the cost. Okay, that might sound a little weird because the IRS has a fairly significant budget for the size of the agency that they have, and you would think that they would be free to fax and mail, use as much postage and whatnot as they want, but they are actually at the operational level, they do try to be aware of the costs that they're incurring. Okay, and I think that you'll start seeing more of this in government agencies in general, just as they try to be more budget conscious, or at least tell us that they're trying to be more budget conscious. Multi-page faxes in particular are discouraged for two reasons. First of all is, they say anyway, transmission quality issues. There's no telling what the resolution and paper quality and that stuff on the receiving end of the fax line is, and so it could be misread or come out bad, whatever. That's one of the excuses. The other thing about multi-page faxes is that multi-page faxes, by their nature, have multiple pages, and different pages can walk off separately. Okay, and so they consider that a potential security risk, both on the sending and the receiving end. Okay. One of the very frustrating things way back in the day when I first got into this business was that the IRS did not like any type of e-fax service. In fact, it was within the customer service section of the IRM. If you mentioned that you had an e-fax type service, they were not supposed to send things to you. Okay, that used to be the protocol. Thankfully, they now recognize that e-fax type services are just as secure, if not actually more secure, than paper fax machines, and they have lifted that old archaic refusal to send to an e-fax service. And in fact, the IRS now has a enterprise level e-fax tool themselves, and most IRS offices are plugged into that. And so there's actually a new IRM section, 11.3.1.14, that now exists to cover the security considerations of that particular tool. And so this is a fairly recent evolution in IRS communication technology, if you will. The section of the IRM also dictates that they use a cover sheet directing the fax to the intended recipient, and also mandates the inclusion of a confidentiality statement that should always be there. Now, I know that this might be a minor point, but One of the reasons for knowing the requirements of the IRM is in order to know what the revenue officer is supposed to do, and so that if you ever need to call them out on something, you're able to do so. Okay. And so if you ever get something from a revenue officer that doesn't have the cover sheet on it, and that cover sheet does not have the confidentiality statement, that's a potential security issue. You don't know what else that revenue officer is doing. It's something that you can call them out on. Okay. And I have found that being able to have something little like that to call out a revenue officer on is a way to tell them that you know what you're doing and that you're going to watch them like a hawk. Okay. And I have found that on occasion, that is necessary in order to get compliance from the revenue officer themselves. Okay. So that's why it's important, I think, to know these tiny little seemingly insignificant things, but it's good for us to know what some of them are. IRM section 5.1.1.4, collection case file checklist. One of the things you should know is that everything within the IRS uses forms and checklists so that they keep their own ducks in a row. You should do the exact same thing. One of the forms that they use is form 13353. This form is not publicly available. I have never, ever seen one, okay? It does not exist, to my knowledge, online. I've never seen anybody post one. The only way to see one is probably to do a FOIA request for it, okay? Which I've never done because I didn't think it was important enough. But this is their collection case file check sheet. Basically, it's them verifying that important forms and documents related to the case are actually documented and included. So, for example, the Form 433D that sets up an installment agreement, or Form 53 that sets up currently not collectible status for hardship cases. The other interesting thing about collection case file management in general is that revenue officers are instructed to remove and destroy unnecessary documents. So things that are, quote, dated and or extraneous material that is not needed to support case closure. So, my biggest takeaway from this is that if you have a particularly complicated case, if you've had a case with a lot of moving pieces, with a lot of documentation, with a lot of third-party contact, with a lot of a very involved case, before you actually get to the final case closure, you may want to do a Freedom of Information Act request in order to get a copy of that entire case file before they purge certain documents, because you never know. They may purge a document that is actually important or may be important in the future. For example, if you go to tax court, okay, or district court, and that it would be valuable to have that, okay? And you want to request that before final case closure so that you can make sure that you're not getting the thinned out file, okay? That's the biggest takeaway from this, because collection case file closure procedures refer to what they're doing with the case after it's done, and when they're sending the case file, the paper case file, to record archival storage, okay? And so you want the full case file, but you got to request it before they start that final case closure purge, so to speak. One of the most important letters that you will ever receive on every case that you work is the case closure letter. The case closure letter says, basically, this is what we're doing, and we're going to get off your back, okay? The majority of case closure letters are generated automatically by ICS, the integrated collection system. And so because they are automatically generated, if you don't receive a case closure letter after you have already established an installment agreement or non-collectible status or full pay or otherwise, it could be a bad sign if you don't get a case closure letter. The three most common reasons that a case closure letter is not actually generated, even though you think the case is closed, is because of one of three things. One, there's still an open del ret case, delinquent return case. Okay, so somebody forgot to close out a delinquent return. Somebody forgot to process a delinquent return. Maybe a revenue officer forgot to forward a filed return that you filed directly with them to the proper authority for processing, etc. It could also mean that the case was left open because it was referred to examination. So you might think that the case is closed, but you never get a case closure letter. And then all of a sudden, 3 months later, you're talking to a revenue agent when you thought the case was closed. Okay, so it could be a referral to exam. Worst case scenario is that the case was never closed out in the computer system because it was marked as open because of a criminal investigation referral. Okay, and so if you think a case is done and you don't get a case closure letter within a few weeks, you need to ask why. The most common case closure letters are letter 4222, notice of case resolution. This is what you'll receive if there was like a credit transfer that rolled forward and paid off a tax period. The taxpayer wrote a check and full paid it, or there was some sort of an adjustment, like a penalty abatement that wiped out the liability, and therefore the case is resolved. So that's a letter 4222. The other common one is the letter 4223, which is a CNC letter for cases that were closed because of economic hardship. So here's just what letter 4222 looks like. It says, notice of case resolution. We've closed your collections case. Based on our records, there are no taxes or tax returns currently due on this case for the tax types and periods listed below. Every time you get one of these letters, number one, do not throw it away. It is a very important letter. Always, this is, even when you clean out your paper files, this is one of the pieces of paper I recommend that you keep in paper format. Okay, if you're doing paper returns, definitely at least scan it and archive it. Okay, but make sure that the tax type and periods that are reflected here are accurate. Make sure that they have not missed a tax period. Okay, so you might be looking at this and go, okay, 1040, 03, 05, 06, 07. What you'll notice here, wait a second, where's 2004? Well, if this client didn't have a tax debt for 2004, then it's not a problem. If they did have a tax debt for 2004, well, it ain't listed. That's a problem. Okay, and so that's what you want to look for on the letter 4222. On a letter 4223, case closure, we have temporarily closed your collection case because we have determined that you don't have the money to pay us. Okay. The key word on letter 4223, and the key word as it relates to everything with currently not collectible status, is the word temporary. Never, ever, ever forget that CNC is temporary. Okay. And again, you're going to want to review this in order to make sure that they haven't missed a tax period. Stephen asked, for tax liens, is there a case closure letter? Tax lien processing, so if you're talking about a release of the statutory tax lien, then you'll receive a Form 668Z in the mail for a tax lien that has been released, if that's what you're asking about. If you're doing a withdrawal, a lien withdrawal, you'll receive a 10916C is the notice number. So, and again, beyond the scope of this class, but remember that releases and withdrawals are very different things. And again, so the release of the statutory tax lien, Form 668Z, 10916C for a withdrawal. So hope that helps, Stephen. IRM section 5.1.1.5.2, manual case closing letter procedures. Like I said in the last slide, the majority of case collection closure letters are generated automatically by the computer system. Okay, once the revenue officer closes out the case. However, in situations where a case has been manually closed out, the revenue has to manually enter yes in the computer system when prompted to generate the power of attorney letter, meaning our copy of the letter. So if you don't get your POA copy of a case closure letter, it may simply be because the revenue officer accidentally hit no on this one. In those cases, if you can get a hold of the client copy, make a copy of the client, the case closure letter copy that the client received. Make a copy of that for your own records, or request one from the revenue officer. That is a very important notice, a very important letter, and you don't want to be without that.
For more tips on growing your tax resolution practice, visit taxmarketinghq.com. Thanks for watching.